Work harder or get out, Julian. It is really that simple. CEO Garrison Drake did not even look up from his sleek tablet when he delivered that cold ultimatum. We were sitting at the polished granite conference table on the 32nd floor of Apex Digital Systems. Surrounding us were 6 senior executives, men and women who had spent the last 4 years watching me maintain our core enterprise infrastructure while they collected generous quarterly bonuses off my quiet labor. My name is Julian Crawford. I am 49 years old, and for 12 long years I served as the Senior Director of Infrastructure and Operations. I was not just another employee at this corporate firm. I was the architect behind our entire back-end delivery matrix and automated compliance engine. But in that climate-controlled boardroom, under the glare of recessed LED lighting, Garrison reduced over a decade of unyielding dedication, 65-hour work weeks, and flawless client delivery to a simple performance defect. We are requiring 25% faster deployment timelines across all enterprise client accounts. Starting next quarter, Garrison continued, leaning back in his executive leather chair and crossing his arms with dismissive authority. If you cannot push your operational engineering teams to achieve those aggressive benchmarks without increasing budget, then you are simply not executive material. You are holding this company back from market dominance. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat against the cool granite table. I did not flinch, and I did not raise my voice. I had spent the past 3 months writing detailed risk reports, warning Garrison and the board that accelerating our complex deployment pipeline without adding qualified headcount would compromise system stability, particularly for our primary accounts. It was not a question of willingness or effort. It was a matter of systemic computing capacity and basic mathematical reality. Garrison, I said, keeping my tone completely even and measured, I have documented the operational vulnerabilities in full detail. Forcing faster delivery cycles without expanding our infrastructure support will breach client service level agreements, especially for our core enterprise contracts. I do not care about your risk assessments, Julian, he snapped, his voice sharp and condescending as he cut me off. I want immediate output. The technology sector moves fast, and if you are too exhausted or too stubborn to keep up, step aside. We have a queue of ambitious young managers, eager to take your title for half your current compensation, so make your decision right now. Work harder, hit the targets without complaint, or hand in your badge and get out. A heavy silence settled over the executive boardroom. The vice president of business development stared intently at his digital stylus. The chief financial officer casually stirred his coffee, looking anywhere but at me. Not a single person spoke up in my defense. No one bothered to remind the chief executive officer that I was the sole reason our primary enterprise clients had not churned in over 6 consecutive years. Looking across the table at Garrison's smug expression, something inside me quietly shifted and solidified. For 12 years, my weakness had been believing that unshakable loyalty and undeniable performance would eventually earn professional respect. I had assumed that if I carried enough operational weight, senior leadership would recognize my true value. But looking at Garrison's cold eyes, I finally understood a vital lesson. Loyalty to leaders who view you as disposable labor is not dedication. It is self-sabotage. I did not argue and I did not negotiate. Instead, I reached up to my lapel, unclipped my heavy silver access badge, and laid it gently on the polished granite table between us. I choose to get out, I said quietly. Garrison blinked for a fraction of a second, momentarily caught off guard by my immediate compliance before a haughty grin returned to his face. Human Resources will process your resignation by 5 o'clock today, he said coldly. Do not expect a severance package or a consulting retainer. I do not expect anything from you, Garrison, I replied smoothly. I stood up, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, picked up my leather briefcase, and turned toward the glass exit doors. As I walked down the carpeted hallway, I heard light laughter echoing behind me in the boardroom. They genuinely believed they had just purged an inflexible manager who was blocking corporate growth. What Garrison Drake failed to comprehend was that our $12 million flagship enterprise contract was anchored entirely to a proprietary operational architecture I had engineered from scratch, and I was walking out the door with every piece of unwritten intuition required to run it. When I stepped out of corporate headquarters into the crisp afternoon air, the sun was reflecting off the towering glass skyscraper I had helped build for 12 years. I stood in the central plaza, drew a deep breath, and felt a profound wave of clarity wash over me. To understand why I surrendered my executive title, my substantial salary, and my professional security without a single moment of hesitation, you have to understand what those 12 years had truly cost me. I joined Apex Digital Systems when the firm operated out of a cramped, windowless office on the third floor of an old commercial district. Back then, we had fewer than 19 employees and an executive leadership team that spent more time pitching glossy slides to venture capital investors than building functional technology. I was hired as an operational specialist at 37, working 75 hours a week because I believed in building a lasting enterprise. Whenever a critical deployment crashed, whenever a primary client threatened legal action for breach of contract, or whenever internal database clusters overloaded at midnight, my personal cell phone was the one that rang. I became the quiet firefighter of the company. I was the leader who stayed until 3 in the morning, restructuring failed workflow pipelines, patching legacy security code, and reassuring enraged corporate clients who were preparing to file multi-million-dollar lawsuits. When senior executives panicked, I established operational order. Over 12 years, I absorbed the structural mistakes of corporate leaders who earned 3 times my salary. I took pride in being the dependable backbone of the firm, foolishly believing that being indispensable rendered me secure. What I failed to recognize back then was the subtle, toxic dynamic growing around me. As Apex Digital Systems expanded into a multi-million-dollar corporation, executive promotions were repeatedly handed to aggressive corporate politicians who specialized in slick presentations and internal maneuvering. Leaders who delivered impressive speeches received massive stock options, while the complex, painstaking operational labor that actually fulfilled those corporate promises fell entirely on my shoulders. My extra effort was never rewarded with equity. It simply became the baseline expectation. If I rescued a failing enterprise account, it was dismissed as my standard duty. If an executive presented my strategic infrastructure blueprint to the board of directors, my name was quietly erased from the title slide before the meeting began. That was their foundational miscalculation. They assumed that because I did not engage in loud office politics, I did not notice when my intellectual labor was stolen. The personal toll of my unyielding loyalty was devastating. I lost count of the anniversary dinners I abandoned to handle offshore server emergencies. I missed major family milestones because a critical deployment portal crashed in Dallas. I delayed personal relationships, neglected health checkups, and allowed my world to shrink into an endless corridor of corporate emergencies. I convinced myself that every sacrifice was an investment in my long-term security. The critical turning point had occurred 4 years prior. Our largest enterprise account, Titan Logistics International, was on the brink of terminating their contract with Apex Digital Systems. They were paying us nearly $12 million annually, accounting for over 40% of our division's recurring revenue. But our back-end delivery pipelines were constantly lagging. Database synchronization was failing, and Titan's legal counsel was preparing a formal breach of contract suit. Garrison Drake, who was then serving as Vice President of Business Development, took Titan's executive team to an expensive steakhouse, made grand promises he had no technical ability to keep, and secured a multi-year contract extension. He immediately pocketed a 6-figure commission bonus, marched back into the office, and dropped the massive, failing project binder onto my desk. "Fix it, Julian," he told me without looking me in the eye. "If we lose Titan, this entire division collapses and everyone gets laid off." I did not complain or throw an executive tantrum. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. Over 18 grueling months, I engineered the complete operational framework that kept that $12 million contract alive. I redesigned the database architecture, established automated risk monitoring checkpoints, and built integrated tracking pipelines that synced perfectly with Titan's legacy software. Because our core platform was prone to memory leaks during peak traffic, I personally wrote custom contingency scripts to throttle data flow and prevent system overloads. More importantly, I built absolute trust with Titan's chief information officer, Dominic Prescott. When a server cluster glitched at 2 in the morning, Dominic did not call Garrison Drake. He called my personal mobile line. He knew that if I gave him a deployment window, it was accurate down to the minute. Furthermore, the Titan contract contains strict service-level agreement penalty clauses. If system downtime exceeded 0.01% in any quarter, Apex Digital Systems faced automated financial penalties of $250,000 per hour. For 4 straight years, I managed those protocols flawlessly, ensuring we never breached a single threshold. What Garrison never understood was that successful operations are deceptive. When a complex enterprise system runs smoothly, arrogant executives assume the work is easy. They see consistent monthly metrics and assume the platform maintains itself. They mistake the quiet efficiency of a master engineer for the total absence of hard work. To Garrison, the $12 million contract was just a static line item on a spreadsheet. He truly believed Titan was loyal to our corporate logo, failing to realize the account was anchored entirely to my custom architecture. By Monday morning, less than 72 hours after I handed in my access badge, Garrison Drake convened an emergency all-hands town hall meeting in the corporate auditorium. He stood on the illuminated stage in front of over 200 employees, beaming with forced executive confidence. But he did not tell them the truth. He did not admit that he had pushed out the senior director who had built the firm's operational foundation. Instead, he spun my departure as a necessary corporate evolution. As we scale our operations toward aggressive global growth, Garrison announced, his voice booming through the auditorium audio system, we must ensure our leadership team consists of agile, forward-thinking visionaries who thrive under pressure. Unfortunately, some legacy managers become resistant to rapid operational evolution and choose to step aside when standards are elevated. We thank Julian Crawford for his past contributions, but Apex Digital Systems is entering a dynamic new era. With those rehearsed sentences, he erased 12 years of my dedication, portraying me as a burnt-out manager who could not handle modern corporate demands. Then came the grand unveiling of my replacement, a 33-year-old middle manager named Elliot Pryor. Elliot was a master of corporate jargon, colorful slide decks, and relentless executive brown-nosing, but he possessed zero hands-on operational experience. He had spent his career jumping from one project to another before the long-term failures of his decisions could catch up to him. To add insult to injury, Garrison proudly announced that Elliot was being promoted to Vice President of Global Infrastructure, receiving a title promotion and a $60,000 salary increase that I had been denied for 3 consecutive years despite delivering record profitability. The final disrespect arrived 48 hours later via an internal corporate newsletter. The lead article credited Elliot with launching a revolutionary operational overhaul designed to accelerate deployment speeds by 25%. When I reviewed the attached policy document on my personal laptop, I saw that the framework Elliot was claiming as his original creation was a literal word-for-word duplicate of a strategic memo I had authored 6 months prior. They had simply removed my header, placed Elliot's name at the top, and published it as their fresh corporate vision. They had not just dismissed me, they had stolen my intellectual work, rebranded my expertise, and used it to validate my replacement. That was the exact moment my quiet disappointment transformed into unshakable resolve. Later that afternoon, my personal phone began receiving frantic text messages from former operational engineers. Julian, Elliot just dismantled our mandatory daily risk assessment audits, one senior developer wrote. He claimed the safety checks were slowing down deployment metrics. We warned him about database latency, but he refused to listen. Another message arrived from an infrastructure analyst. Elliot is demanding the decryption keys for the Titan automated data bridge. He cannot find them in your handover folder. Can you send them over? I looked at the messages sitting on my screen. In past years, my immediate reaction would have been to rush to their assistance, spend hours explaining back-end protocols, and rescue leadership from their own ignorance. But I was no longer on their payroll. I typed back a single measured response. All standardized operating procedures and handover documents were securely archived on the central corporate server prior to my exit. Elliot can access them through standard human resources protocol. I wish the team the very best. I placed my phone face down on the desk and smiled softly. Garrison had made a catastrophic calculation. He believed I would eventually return as a low-cost independent consultant once my savings dwindled. He assumed my self-worth was dependent on the company's survival. What he failed to realize was that executive confidence built on buzzwords collapses the moment it encounters complex operational reality. I spent my first week of freedom reviewing my legal posture with a premier employment attorney. I wanted to verify my non-disclosure parameters, intellectual property boundaries, and restrictive covenants. Under state employment law and federal statutes, including the Warren Act under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, as well as federal copyright protections under Title 17, Section 106, Garrison's forced constructive dismissal without a severance package rendered broad non-compete clauses legally void ab initio. Furthermore, every core architectural methodology I developed was derived from open industry standards and my pre-existing expertise. I had adhered strictly to every legal boundary. I was completely unencumbered and legally free. On my 10th day of freedom, my phone rang with an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately. It was Eleanor Cross, the managing partner at Summit Enterprise Tech, our firm's primary corporate competitor. Summit had been trying to breach the enterprise logistics sector for years, but they had repeatedly lost market share to Apex Digital Systems because our operational reliability was vastly superior. "Julian," Eleanor said, skipping formal niceties, "we heard you departed Apex Digital Systems. I will not waste your time with corporate pleasantries. We know you were the true operational engine behind their enterprise infrastructure. We want to offer you the Chief Operating Officer position at Summit Enterprise Tech, complete with executive equity, complete authority over infrastructure strategy, and a compensation package doubling your previous earnings." I leaned back in my office chair, taking a calm breath. In earlier years, I would have felt an overwhelming rush of emotional validation, but 12 years of corporate maneuvers had taught me the value of patience. I told Eleanor I was deeply interested, but requested 5 days to review Summit's current infrastructure audit reports before executing any formal employment contract. I wanted to ensure Summit prioritized operational integrity rather than short-term optics. 48 hours later, another call arrived on my personal line. This one was from Dominic Prescott, the Chief Information Officer at Titan Logistics International. "Julian, I am calling you directly from my personal phone," Dominic said, his tone grim and serious. "I just concluded an operational debrief with Garrison Drake and his new vice president, Elliot Pryor. They claimed you left the company suddenly due to personal health reasons. Within 48 hours of your departure, our primary automated data bridge suffered a severe 3-hour latency blackout. When we demanded technical explanations, Elliot stumbled through a canned script about scheduled maintenance. I listened quietly, maintaining absolute professional neutrality. I no longer represent Apex Digital Systems, Dominic," I replied softly. "I cannot comment on their internal network operations." Dominic let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "Health reasons, Julian? I have worked with you for 4 years. I know Garrison Drake pushed you out because he believed enterprise operations ran on autopilot. What he failed to comprehend is that our $12 million account was never contracted to his corporate logo. It was contracted to your personal execution. Our board of directors is convening an emergency contract review meeting this Friday." That was the precise moment the tide fully turned. I did not have to launch a smear campaign, leak corporate secrets, or break a single non-disclosure agreement. I simply had to step back, maintain my professional dignity, and allow the weight of their own arrogance to drag them into operational reality. While Garrison and Elliot were celebrating their new titles in corporate headquarters, the underlying structural foundation of Apex Digital Systems was disintegrating. By the 3rd week following my exit, the operational breakdown was no longer an internal secret. On a Tuesday morning, Elliot's decision to bypass daily automated risk audits resulted in a catastrophic database failure. The central transaction cluster, powering Titan's international shipping hubs, suffered an unhandled memory leak and crashed completely. For 5 continuous hours, automated freight tracking across 15 international distribution hubs came to a complete standstill. Over 15,000 freight shipments were stranded, triggering massive downstream financial penalties for Titan's commercial partners. Under the explicit terms of the $12 million contract I had managed, any unhandled outage exceeding 2 hours constituted a material breach of contract, incurring an immediate automated penalty of $250,000 per hour of downtime, along with Titan's legal right to terminate the agreement instantly without notice. Gobicital panic erupted on the 32nd floor of Apex Digital Systems. Former colleagues later informed me that Garrison Drake stormed into Elliot's corner office, red-faced and screaming so loudly that staff across the entire floor froze. Elliot, who had built his career hiding behind polished slide decks, completely withered under the pressure. He attempted to blame offshore developers, then blamed internal IT staff, and finally claimed that I had deliberately left behind corrupted legacy code designed to sabotage the firm. Garrison immediately ordered an emergency technical audit, convinced his senior engineers could isolate and patch the system within hours. But when the engineering team analyzed the core architecture, they discovered a cold reality. My custom contingency scripts were not corrupted. They were intricate operational bridges designed to compensate for the company's outdated database software. I had spent 4 years fine-tuning those parameters based on transaction volume spikes and network traffic patterns. It was not something a replacement manager could master by scanning a manual. It required 12 years of deep intuitive context that Garrison had dismissed as easily replaceable labor. By Thursday afternoon, legal counsel from Titan Logistics International formally served Apex Digital Systems with an official notice of contract default. They granted the firm a strict 72-hour window to restore complete network stability and present a comprehensive operational remediation plan signed by a certified systems architect, or the $12 million enterprise contract would be terminated immediately, accompanied by a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty and damages. The illusion of executive perfection completely shattered. Staff across the firm, who had remained silent during my public exit, began voicing outrage on internal communication channels. Senior engineers flatly refused to accept responsibility for Elliot's operational blunders. Department heads openly questioned Garrison's leadership during executive sessions, pointing out that the firm had sacrificed its most valuable operational asset over an arrogant power move. Meanwhile, sitting in a quiet downtown office, I officially signed my employment agreement with Summit Enterprise Tech as Chief Operating Officer. I was granted full structural authority, substantial equity options, and an executive team that respected operational precision. My personal phone buzzed on the desk. The caller identification displayed the central corporate switchboard of Apex Digital Systems. I did not answer. I simply let it ring until the screen dimmed back to black. On Friday morning, less than 24 hours before Titan's legal deadline was set to expire, my phone rang again. This time it was Garrison Drake's personal mobile phone. I permitted it to ring 3 times before answering. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited in quiet silence. "Julian, is that you?" Garrison's voice came through the receiver, but the haughty, commanding tone that had defined him for 12 years was entirely gone. In its place was a strained, desperate pitch that sounded completely unraveled. "Speaking, Garrison," I replied, keeping my voice as calm as still water. "Julian, thank goodness," he exhaled sharply. "Look, I am calling you directly because there has been a massive operational miscommunication between senior executive leadership and your former department. The board and I have been reviewing our infrastructure structure, and we realized that the transition following your departure was executed poorly, extremely poorly." I sat back in my executive armchair at Summit, holding a warm cup of coffee, listening to a chief executive officer unravel in real time. "Is that so, Garrison?" "Yes," Garrison rushed on, his words stumbling over one another. We recognize that your operational knowledge is indispensable to our enterprise infrastructure. Elliot Pryor was clearly unprepared for the technical scope of the Titan account. In fact, I am prepared to relieve Elliot of his duties effective immediately. I want to bring you back to Apex Digital Systems, Julian, not as Senior Director, but as Executive Vice President of Global Infrastructure. We will double your previous base salary, grant substantial equity options, and guarantee absolute operational autonomy over your team. It was the exact title, authority, and compensation package I had spent 3 consecutive years requesting. 4 years ago, that offer would have felt like a monumental professional triumph. But sitting in my new office, hearing the panic in his voice, I felt only a quiet, profound clarity. I felt pity for the professional I used to be, the man who had begged for validation from a leader who never respected him. "What about the $12 million Titan contract, Garrison?" I asked softly. Garrison hesitated, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "We are facing a critical audit, Julian. The database architecture experienced an unexpected latency failure during Tuesday's deployment. Dominic Prescott from Titan is threatening to cancel the entire contract by 5 o'clock today unless we present a remediation plan signed personally by you. They refuse to accept Elliot or our IT directors. They will only accept your signature." That was when the complete truth emerged. Garrison was not calling because he recognized my dedication, my expertise, or my 12 years of service. He was calling because his own executive career was on the line. If Titan walked away, 40% of the company's revenue would vanish overnight. The board of directors would initiate an immediate vote of no confidence, and Garrison would be ousted in disgrace. "Garrison," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "On Thursday afternoon in the boardroom, you looked at me in front of the entire executive team and told me to work harder or get out. You said anyone could do my job for half my salary. Do you recall saying those exact words?" A suffocating silence hung over the line for several seconds. "Julian, please," Garrison stammered, his polished executive persona entirely collapsing. "I was under extreme corporate pressure. I said things in the heat of the moment that I deeply regret. We built this operational platform together over 12 years. You cannot simply let the company fall apart over a personal misunderstanding." "It was never a personal misunderstanding, Garrison," I answered smoothly. "It was a cold business calculation. You calculated that my dedication rendered me weak and that my quiet nature meant I was disposable. You took my strategic frameworks, handed them to Elliot, and let him claim my intellectual labor as his own creation name. Your price," Julian Garrison begged, his voice cracking with unvarnished desperation, "$400,000 consulting retainer. Just log into the corporate server, re-enable the contingency scripts, and sign the remediation document for Dominic. Please, Julian, I am asking you as a colleague." "I am no longer your colleague, Garrison," I said calmly, "and my self-respect is not for sale." Before he could respond, I disconnected the call. Within 2 hours, word spread across the industry. The board of directors at Apex Digital Systems convened an emergency meeting upon discovering that Garrison had alienated the single engineer holding 40% of their corporate revenue together. At 4 o'clock, Titan Logistics International officially served legal notice terminating their $12 million contract due to irreparable contract default and breach of service level agreements. When I closed my laptop that evening, Apex Digital Systems was confronting a ruinous lawsuit. Garrison was under formal board investigation, and I was completely free. On Monday morning, 3 weeks after leaving my former employer, I walked into the headquarters of Summit Enterprise Tech as Chief Operating Officer. The contrast was immediate. There were no toxic politics or arrogant ultimatums. Eleanor Cross welcomed me warmly, introduced me to the executive board, and escorted me to a spacious corner office overlooking the city. My presence was valued as an executive asset. My first major initiative at Summit was building a specialized enterprise logistics infrastructure division. I brought on a team of exceptional operational engineers, including 3 senior analysts from my former firm who had resigned immediately following Titan's contract termination. I ensured my team received competitive compensation, proper resources, and explicit credit during board presentations. I became the executive leader I had needed years earlier, 4 weeks later, Titan Logistic International officially opened a competitive bidding process for their enterprise infrastructure provider. Because I had engineered the architecture that had protected their operations for 4 years, Titan invited Summit to submit a proposal. During the pitch presentation, I presented a transparent operational blueprint that guaranteed system stability without risk. Dominic Prescott signed the multi-year agreement on the spot. The $12 million enterprise contract that Garrison Drake had lost through arrogance and neglect was officially brought under my leadership at Summit. But this time, it was not maintained through invisible, unappreciated labor. It was backed by a firm that respected my expertise and compensated me fairly. The fallout for Apex Digital Systems was swift. The board terminated Garrison Drake without severance. Elliot Pryor was dismissed shortly after, as remaining client accounts suffered operational issues. The company's stock valuation collapsed by 60%, forcing severe corporate downsizing. When colleagues ask if I feel petty triumph regarding my former company's collapse, I give them the exact same answer: no. True victory is not about seeking petty revenge or engaging in dramatic office conflicts. Ultimate triumph is walking away with your dignity intact, knowing your professional value when others try to diminish you, and building a career so successful that those who mistreated you become entirely irrelevant to your future. Walking away was not my defeat. It was the moment I finally chose myself.